You're listening to Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom, featuring Gary Bauer, Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute. And now, here's Gary.
Hi, this is Gary Bauer with the James Dobson Family Institute. It's a pleasure to be with you. Welcome to our podcast, Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom. Really glad that you're here. We want you back every week, and we want you to bring more listeners to us. Well, as it ends up, 2023 is kind of an anniversary of sorts. Many of you know I worked for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. It was an incredible 8 years for me. But in 1983, Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Orlando, Florida, to the National Association of Evangelicals. It became a famous speech. It was called the Evil Empire speech, because in that speech, Reagan labeled the Soviet Union, communist Russia, as an evil empire that had to be defeated. Now, you may be saying to yourself, you may even be getting ready to turn the knob off here, like, I'm not going to listen to a 40-year-old speech. Well, look, it's really relevant to today. Because it's an anniversary, I heard that reference. I began to go back and look at the speech, and it was amazing to me how many things the president touched on are being debated right now. So imagine yourself in that audience of evangelicals in Orlando, Florida, 40 years ago, when Ronald Reagan gives this speech. He starts out by quoting the founding fathers. Reagan believed in our founding fathers. And unlike a lot of educators today, he actually knew what those founding fathers said and what they believed. He started off by quoting William Penn. "If we will not be governed by God," said Penn, "we must be governed by tyrants." Then Reagan moved on to Thomas Jefferson. The founding fathers that the leftists are telling us didn't want religion to have anything to do with government. Well, Reagan quoted Jefferson saying, "The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time." And then he kind of wrapped up the founding fathers by quoting the first president of the United States, George Washington. And the quote Reagan used was, "Of all the habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Now, when George Washington said religion, my friends, he meant Christianity. I mean, these founders are talking at a time when 99.9999% of the early nation was Christian. That's what the founding fathers were appealing to. Later in the speech, after studying that framework, Reagan started saying things in his own words, things like, "Freedom prospers when religion is vibrant, and the rule of law under God is acknowledged." Now, this is really interesting because, again, this is a speech on really foreign policy. He wanted to rally evangelicals, Christian Americans, behind his foreign policy of confronting communism. But in the speech, he starts talking about the rights of parents. Sounds familiar, right? That's what the James Dobson Family Institute has been talking about week after week after week, year after year, the importance of parents and grandparents to be involved in the education of their children. So Reagan said the rights of parents and the rights of family take precedence over those of Washington-based bureaucrats and social engineers. I love that phraseology. And by the way, I would add the rights of parents are rights that are over the rights of left-wing teacher unions or LGBTQ plus groups that are trying to talk to our children and grandchildren about material and ideas about sexuality that no one should be telling our children other than us as parents and grandparents. Well, as President Reagan got deeper into the speech, he began to get closer to foreign policy. Listen to this quote. "While America's military strength is important, let me add here that I've always maintained that the struggle now going on for the world will never be decided by bombs or rockets, by armies or military might. The real crisis we face today, Reagan said, is a spiritual one. At root, it is a test of moral will and faith. Ladies and gentlemen, that holds true today, not just in foreign policy, but more importantly, that holds true in the battle that's going on in America right now for the hearts and minds of our children. This great struggle going on in the country between those of us that believe that liberty comes from God and those in our country, powerful forces that believe that liberty comes from government. Later in the speech, Reagan sort of led the evangelical audience in prayer, or at least he called on them to pray. And by the way, as I said, I worked for him for 8 years. Ronald Reagan was a man of prayer. In fact, he was actually convinced that the assassination attempt on him a couple of years before failed because God had things he wanted Reagan to do in defeating Soviet communism. And Reagan regularly prayed to have God lead him in that effort. This is what he says in his speech to the evangelicals. Let us pray for the salvation of all those who live in that totalitarian darkness. He was referring to the people trapped behind the Iron Curtain in communism. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God. Can you imagine a U.S. president today saying that his prayer is that people around the world under totalitarian governments would come to know God? That alone would cause a tremendous controversy. And then Reagan adds, but until they do, let us be aware that while they preach, and now he's referring to the communist government, while they preach the supremacy of the state, of the government, declare it omnipotent over individual men, and predict its eventual domination of all people on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world, referring to the Soviet Union. Well, that's what made the headlines, but so many of the things in this speech are right on target. Now, toward the end of the speech, Reagan said something, and I remember this all very well because I was working in the White House and I had some input on this, but Reagan said something at the time I thought was sort of a prophecy, and I was optimistic and confident that it would come true. Today, I'm not so sure. And that's why we want you to be involved in the public square. Reagan said this, speaking to the communists, they must be made to understand we will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedoms. We will never, he said, abandon our belief in God. He's referring to the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus. Well, now, if it would be so from Reagan's mouth to God's ears, but we all know, I hope you know, that the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, they're under incredible pressure and attack today. In some cases, they're hanging on by a thread. Just a cursory reading of the articles in the newspaper every day or on the evening news will show you that. And certainly, if you're listening to these podcasts, if you're listening to the James Dobson Family Talk Show, you're getting this information on a regular basis. Now, the Soviet Union fell in 1991, 8 years after Reagan gave this speech. But many of the darkest ideas that the Soviet Union embraced are growing right now in the United States. That's a scary thought, ladies and gentlemen. There are growing numbers of Americans that don't believe in God. In fact, among the rising generation, there is the lowest level of the belief in God of any generation in American history. And even some people that do believe in God are rejecting the idea that it's a personal God, a God that is the author of our liberty. Many people who believe in God are believing it, are buying into the lie that our liberty comes from government. And then finally, and this is perhaps most dangerous of all, there are countless Americans who believe in God and believe Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, but also believe we should have nothing to do with government and politics. And if that belief gains momentum and followers, I can tell you that America is doomed, this great experiment in liberty under God. Now, when I say that the forces of Marxism and socialism are gaining strength in America, I am not exaggerating. You know, just a few weeks ago, there was a resolution introduced in Congress. It was a resolution condemning totalitarianism, condemning communism and socialism, and making the point that those philosophies have caused the deaths of 100 million human beings made in the image of God. It's a thought that's almost impossible to process. You know, Lenin or Stalin, one of the early leaders of the Soviet Union, was once asked by a brave reporter, "How do you sleep at night, knowing that your Marxist policies, your communism, has resulted in the deaths of millions of people?" And I believe it was Stalin leaned forward and said, "Well, look, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs." So under Soviet communism, human beings were the equivalent of eggs to crack for some greater purpose. We are a society, we are a government, we are a nation built on the idea that human beings have all been made in the image of God and have dignity and value and worth, and that their lives are precious. Well, the Congress was asked to vote on this resolution condemning communism, socialism, and totalitarianism. Ladies and gentlemen, up until a few years ago, this would have been a unanimous vote. Now, I'm happy to tell you that the resolution did pass, but the vote was 328 to 86. 86 members of the House of Representatives voted no on condemning Marxism and socialism. Now, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but I think the information is useful. Every Republican in the House of Representatives voted to condemn Marxism and communism. And thankfully, 100 Democrats voted to do the same. But 86 Democrats voted not to condemn Marxism and socialism. And 14 other Democrats, quite frankly, cowards, simply voted present. You'll have to ask them why they would do that. Why even show up? That's a telling vote, my friends. And that really is the battle that's going on in America today. Are we going to be in the country the founders gave us, built on the idea that liberty comes from God, that government ought to be small in size and allow us the natural liberty God has given us, made in his image? Or are we going to go down the road, further down the road, of socialism and communism, which has already worked its way into the classrooms of America? The answer to that question is going to depend on you, on parents and grandparents and our allies. This is what the James Dobson Family Institute is dedicated to. This is what James Dobson has devoted his life to and continues to work for now. That's why we have this podcast. The future of the country is hanging in the balance. The future of our children and grandchildren is at stake. And this is what we will be revisiting time and time again on this podcast, which is why we're so glad you're here listening. And we want you to be back, and we want you to bring friends, neighbors, and people from your church with you. I want to close with sort of a summary of what you as parents and grandparents ought to be teaching your children. All of our children ought to know who said, "Give me liberty," or "Give me death," and who said, "I have a dream." Our children ought to know what good music sounds like and what Constitution Hall looks like, and what happened in that hall. They ought to know what happened at Concord Bridge and on the fields of Antietam and the beaches of Normandy, and how their liberty was won and preserved in those places. And yes, they ought to know about Jonathan and David and Ruth and Naomi and about the kingdom yet to come. In short, they ought to know how to love the things we love and to honor the things we honor. Only by doing that can we save our children and grandchildren, and by saving them, save our dear country. God bless you. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for this podcast, Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom.
Subscribe to Gary Bauer's Defending Faith, Family, and Freedom, where you find your favorite podcasts. Just hit the subscribe button to ensure you receive every episode.